Today we have Karen Rose on the Plant Cunning podcast, and we are so thrilled to speak with you today. So, how are you, Karen? Starting out.
I am good. I am good. As I was just saying, I can't wait for the winter to be over and to see plants come in again. I guess that's what I'm waiting for mostly.
Yeah, totally. We're both in New York here in New York City. We're in the country, but yeah, we're both very excited about spring as well.
Yeah, we got teased so hard. It was like spring, and then it's like 20 degrees and a foot of snow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been following you on social media for a long time. You have the beautiful Sacred Vibes Apothecary. You have a new spice shop in the city. You do an herb school, an herb conference, and you've just written this amazing book, The Art and Practice of Spiritual Herbalism. And Isaac and I have just been enjoying it and sharing it with our guests that have come over. It's just such a beautiful book. And I guess I should start with our traditional first question. How did you come to the plant path?
And so thank you for talking about the book and sharing it with people and reading it. The plant path, well, I want to start by saying, people are always like, oh, so you're an herbalist, so you changed your name to Rose. And I'm like, actually, actually not. My family's name has been Rose, so I'm not one of those herbalists who's like, now call me Heather, or whatever. The plant name the family name has always been Rose. So I feel in a lot of ways that the plant chose me, like the plant walk chose my generation to come through. And so when I think about the start, I definitely have to credit my grandmother and my grandfather, my grandmother and my mom's side, my grandfather and my father's side, who were both plant people. And so people who use plants to heal spiritual things that were happening in their community, as well as physical things that were happening with their community. So, I came to it just being born into that family is what, I'd like. Yeah, that's my answer.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So, so you grew up around like plants and around,
healing,
the spiritual, the healing path. That's really cool.
It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So when did you decide to become an herbalist, like full time, like as your profession or purpose? Yeah,
and that's another thing. So like my grandmother was always a plant healer, but we didn't have, I say in the book, and when I speak, I say, we didn't have a name for my grandma. She was just known in the community as the person that you would go to take care of whatever. But most people in the community also had a knowledge, right? They had plant knowledge. I talked about how plant knowledge was kind of passed on, like how people prepare you to be an adult. Kind of like, oh, you should probably know a few meals before you move out of this house. It was kind of the same thing. Like, you should probably know a few plant medicines if you're going to have a family. You should probably know what this plant is for if you're going to have a home and a yard. And they would say, well, yeah, you could grow this plant for food, but also, do you know? And it's the same way still when I go back and visit the Caribbean, they're always like, yeah, this plant could be used like this, but do you know that it also helps this and that it does this? So it was like this teaching that was always happening. We didn't have a name like, oh, you're studying herbalism. It was just kind of this overall teaching that they felt was so important for us to learn. So I say that my teaching or my walk as an herbalist began quite like it was like intrinsic to my growth. However, when I came to the US and I had my own child, Lauren, and I wanted to like use plant medicine with her, I realized that so much of my knowledge was on plants back home and not plants here in that existed in the Western, world. So that is when I went back to school to study herbalism and was like what we call Western herbalism, and started to identify the plants that grew around me and how to use them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Yeah, but there's a lot of differences between like tropical Caribbean and New York.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was funny because I was living in Arizona. So I was living in the desert.
Oh.
And I was calling my grandmother, who Guyana, where I is my home country, is on the equator. It's next to Brazil and Venezuela and Suriname. So we're right on the equator. And so my grandmother would talk about these plants. And I was like, I'm in the desert. The equator and the desert, not the same thing at all.
Yeah, very like arid, dry, like got cacti and stuff.
Yeah, manzanilla and brittle bush and chaparral.
Oh, yeah.
Versus like equator rainforest, plants that you're like succulent and full, and then it's totally different climate.
Yeah, and I think that's important too. Like you talk about in your book, and we've talked about this a lot over the episodes. Is like how important it is to be part of your local ecosystem and like know the plants that grow around you and use those instead of relying on like exotic herbs from halfway across the world. But yeah, so then you had to change again to move to New York too. So when did that happen?
Well, when we immigrated, I immigrated to New York. So I was, I call myself a Brooklynite because I was 14 and I grew up here pretty much. So Brooklyn is like my home in the Americas. I somehow got up when I was 21 and was like, I'm moving to Arizona. As all, 18-year-old, like after school, you're like, I want to see something completely different, right? And then you get to Arizona and then you have children and you realize that you're alone. Like my parents are here, my sisters are here, and I'm like, oh, this is hard, and they're all like, oh, you could come home, So that's kind of like what happened with me moving back to New York. But it was this reconnection that my soul needed so much. My stint at like, I want to be independent. I want to try to, it was over. I completely realized how much I needed my parents, how much I needed community, how important it was for me to raise my children in Flatbush, Brooklyn, so that they can be in touch with like their Caribbean heritage. Cause that wasn't something that I could find out in Arizona. Like I wanted to raise my children in the community in which I grew up in, which is like a heavily Caribbean community, very diverse. We have accessibility to lots of like medicines that come in from the Caribbean and that, that opportunity here in Brooklyn. So yeah, it was a move that was like ordained for sure.
Yeah, totally.
Well, sometimes you got to do that, like got to go out somewhere far away to find out what, the importance of home.
It is so true. It is so true. Because I missed it. I would always say, oh, the food, I missed it completely.
Mm-hmm. So to go back a little bit to your book, what was the inspiration for writing the art and practice of spiritual herbalism for you?
I think that inspiration for me was my apprenticeship program. When I came back to Brooklyn and I opened up Sacred Vibes Apothecary, I started an apprenticeship program. But before I started that apprenticeship program, I was teaching another apprenticeship program with some other people. Mm-hmm. And I remember like talking about spirit in one class, and someone was like, oh, I came here to learn about plants, not about spirit. And I was like, well, then, this may not be. So even then, I feel like the ancestors were at work, like kind of like, yeah, this is what you want to do, but find your own space, find your own way that you can really teach from what you truly believe. And I truly believe that plants are spiritual beings. That's something I've always been raised with. I've witnessed it since I was a child. It's been used on me as spiritual medicines from plants have been used for my personal healing. So it was really difficult to divorce the two. Yeah. So I knew at that moment that I needed to create a space where I could like educate like-minded people about how plants being a spiritual entity and us being a spiritual entity, how we can achieve the miracle that's called healing, right? And so the work of this apprenticeship for over the last 12 years is what's really in that book, is this gathering of information and this this ability now that I knew that this book would reach an audience that I was much wider than who I could teach, but people were still wanting that same information because through my apprentices program, I was finding folks that was like, I always believed that my grandma practiced that, my grandfather, my aunt practiced that. So many people would say, this is our ancestral practice. And I knew this was true and I needed something to connect to it. And so it was like, this book was written for those folks who were like, who are hungry for that information and that connection back to their own lineage and the truth that we know about these medicines.
Very, very beautiful. Yeah, it's definitely hard to divorce the spiritual nature of plants and just, focus on the plant constituents and how they can help the body. And yeah, that's one thing that I really liked about the book is that you're incorporating, so many different aspects of how you as a healer operate, the spiritual side, the emotional side, the ancestral side, astrology, all these different systems. And one example, I mean, you start with the heart, you start with the circulatory system. So I'm wondering if you can dive in a little bit deeper to describe the spiritual healing that can happen for somebody around the heart, around the circulatory system, the plants that you work with, the orishas that you work with.
Yeah, I that chapter specifically is like really close to me because my mom has had heart issues. My mom's sister had passed away from heart failure when she was 50. So, seeing these things in my family, I definitely was like, well, how do I prevent these things from happening with me, or at least shore up some of my own ways of, of how I was feeling, especially having a daughter and not wanting to like this to travel through lineages. And I believe the things that are hereditary are spiritually hereditary too. Like we can't say like, oh, my eyes look like my mom, or my smile looks like my mom, or, the way I move my hand looks like the way my dad talks, and not realize that we're also inheriting spiritual things that has been happening with them too, right? In their generation, in their lineage. And so this became really clear to me while working with my mother, because I then began to understand that other people in her family also had heart issues. And it was like the women in the family, this maternal lineage. So I was looking at it like, okay, what are some things that I could use to help? Well, of course, hawthorn, right? I could use hawthorn to help my heart. But also hawthorn is not just about the way in which it helps to like shore up our blood vessels, and strengthen our circulatory system. Hawthorn is also about the protection that we need. Hawthorn is also about acting courageously and loving and having this open heart and trust, right? And I began to realize that the protection that's necessary for your heart is demonstrated quite clearly with the thorns that are in hawthorn or rose or any of the rosacea family, which all benefit the heart. And all of them have thorns, which is like this deep, a soft beauty, but this deep, soft opening and beauty that needs to be protected. And I think that, when I speak personally about my family, I realize that the women in that lineage would overuse their heart in many ways, like give beyond, like have this heart that is so open that they take in things that many of us would never take in, or like open their hearts so widely without the protection that they needed. But also when they got hurt, their default was to completely close their heart, to live these really cold, uninvolved lives after being hurt. And so there needed to be some way that we can allow ourselves to live with an open heart and still feel protected and not feel that we need to close our heart off because of the hurt that's encompassing. We're going to get hurt over and over again. It's not, that's the one thing we're kind of sure of, is that we will be hurt again in this lifetime. And then, but not using that as a I don't want to say excuse, but not using that as the reason to close our heart off and live these cold-hearted, disconnected from our heart kind of lives. And so I felt that, that chapter talked a lot about like, keep opening your heart, how important it is physically to keep letting love in, to keep the heart itself is an organ that's like, it's about opening and closing, giving and receiving, circulating. And the moments that we're like, nope, we're going to lock this off, close this off, the body literally gets that message, right? To shut that function down and to harden. Arteriosclerosis is like the number one cause of death, especially within women of color in the United States. And that hardening of the heart can happen because of a number of reasons, for a number of hurts that we're facing. And doing the emotional and the spiritual work to keep that open, I think, is the biggest part of where we could find healing.
Yeah. And that the focusing on the protective aspect too, I think is so important. And something I realized while reading this was like, I always see the heart as solar. You talk about that too, but some of the herbs you use in there have a very martial aspect. Garlic and cayenne are very Mars, red, fiery, hot, spicy.
Yes,
Keeps the circulation going, but it's also protective.
Absolutely. And so that's how come it's parallel to the Orisha Ogun, who is this warrior and this fighter and this protector. And but Ogun is also known as the peacekeeper. Because sometimes, the ways in which we keep boundaries has to come from, us being able to say enough, like the ways in which Ogun demonstrates his strength is also by knowing and trusting the self. So I think that's super important that we can have, this energy of the sun, this bright light, but that bright light also needs protection.
Yeah. And I really loved how you started with the heart. I mean, I know there's personal reasons too, but there also, like, as you mentioned, I mean, heart disease is the leading cause of death in the US. But even like going back to, I've been reading Blaugrave's Physic. He was a 17th century English astrological herbalist. And he always started with solar herbs and solar, amulets, basically. In every cure, he starts with the heart and with the sun. And I think it just points that is to how important that is,
Absolutely, I agree.
The heart is just, it's like the center of your physical body, but it's also like it's one of those things where even in contemporary Western industrialized culture is seen as more than just physical.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Hence all the love songs and everything designed around love. It's definitely more than just physical. And it's that reminder, that we can't be in discontent and unhappiness and have healthy hearts. Like it's, yeah.
Totally. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how it works to inherit ancestral heart pain or ancestral trauma, or like how do you perceive that happens, and how do you relate to your ancestors, and how can we get in touch with healing those traumas?
Well, the indigenous always believe, any indigenous culture that you study, always believe that we're just not here on our own merit. Like we are here because of the ancestors. We've been chosen to be here because of the ancestors. Why did our ancestors choose us at this time? A lot of it is to do the work, to complete the work that they begun, right? To begin to see how we can heal, whether it's them dying without getting the forgiveness they needed, or them passing without having the conversations with their families that they needed. Like, it's our turn. right? And so I definitely believe like one of the ways in which we inherit these things is that message. It's in our DNA. Our DNA just comes in with the message about what is necessary for us to heal in this time. What happens is then those things begin to come up and we start to heal them. But one tangible way I really look at this is as we get older, it never fails. Someone is going to say, oh, you really remind me of your mom, or your mom would have answered that the same way you did. Or, yeah, you sound like, my kids will be like, you sound just like grandma. And sometimes I'm like horrified, right? Because that's the same thing I don't like in my mom. And my kids will be like, you sound just like grandma. And in those moments, I realize that I'm still holding on to the same pattern. I'm still carrying the same pattern. And it's making a conscious choice about that is really deep. Sometimes children don't even live with their parents, and yet they emulate, right, their parents in so many ways. Sometimes like I said, the very thing that we despise, we suddenly find ourselves like doing when we're in relationships with other people. And so in those moments, our consciousness could cause us to pause and say, this is some healing that still needs to happen. And why, for me, it's asking the question of like, okay, so if this is showing up in me and this is showing up in my mom, like this probably showed up in my grandmother too. And where is this coming from? Where is this coming from? What's the story that's like behind that? And you notice in the book, I talk about getting our parents to talk to us about some of those stories, because I think it's important to be like, well, and I felt that was important, especially for me when addressing the heart. I was like, well, who else had heart disease and what really was happening in their lives? And, and so my mom started remembering so much about like, oh, yes, this was happening. And we traced it back to these incredible heartbreaks that kept happening along the lineage. And, me now taking that on and saying, I'm going to work on my heart, and I'm going to work to strengthen my heart, and I'm going to work for forgiveness for the heartbreaks that happened to me, heals them. Because it heals generation backwards and it heals generation forwards. And also it was important for me to do this with my daughter, because it was about healing her babies that could possibly be coming too. It wasn't just for me.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, because going back to indigenous wisdom is there's always thinking about the generations to come, the generations behind, and the generations to come, and seeing yourself as part of this, just a part of a living lineage.
Yes, it's all circular. It's all circular. Many indigenous babies, when they're born, we ask like, who are you? Who has come forth this time? Believing that our ancestors are coming again through these new beings that are coming. They're connected to the ancestors who had lived before. So it's like, why are you coming forth again is important also to take a look at. That's part of your, why you're here.
Yeah, one part of your book, you talk about how female bodies, like we have all of the eggs in our ovaries of our daughters and therefore our granddaughters, like inside of us at one time. And so it makes sense, like physically, like if something happens to our grandmother, well, our, seed of being was in them. It's literally in our DNA. Like you said, it's like passed down.
Absolutely, 100%. Yes.
Yeah, it's just so wild to think about.
I know, it is so wild to think about, because then, and so many of my students will say, I'm overwhelmed. Like just thinking about it, I'm completely overwhelmed, because now I'm not even full. Like I have my healing to do, and now I have all this other healing. And I say to them, it's one and the same.
Yeah.
Like, don't feel like you have to go back and heal your grandmother's life, but it's the same as you healing your life. It revert, what is that word I'm looking for?
Reverberates, is that what you're saying?
Yes, reverberates backwards too and forward. It is not just like, oh, now I got to do this work of healing my grandmother. It's the same healing. It's the same healing. And it's also, like I said, it's also providing or having the next generation witness your healing too. That's already preparing them to do, less of their own.
Right. Like what you said about how important it was for your daughter to be with you when you were having these conversations with your mother.
Yeah. And the healing work. And, and I think it's so difficult because, I feel like my mom's generation, there are many reasons why, but they were really my mom's generation was really a generation that held a lot of secrets. And even, and I find that when I teach and I speak, when I speak to my students, they're like, yes, it's really difficult to get my mom to talk. They're like, what's done is done. There's no need to rehash that. Some people just are like, oh, I don't even know what you're talking about. It's like, it's hard to get those conversations to open. And so it's a necessary part of this healing is getting those conversations to open up. So when they are open, I take full advantage of it. I'm like, okay, let's keep going. What could you remember that can help us? Yeah.
That's really smart. I'm definitely going to keep that in mind for those rare occasions when I really can dive in deep with my grandmothers. And
well, it's also so important to like take the opportunities to speak with your elders because they're not going to be there forever,
Absolutely. And it's so funny some of the stories that is, I could talk to my dad, and every time I sit with my dad, it's a different story that I need to hear. And I'm like, how come you didn't tell me that before? And he's like, well, it just came. I don't know. It just came up. So it's like the older they get, the more they like kind of share a bit about their, they remember, like they remember the past clearer than they remember the present, So I'm like, tell me all about your childhood. Now is definitely the time to sit with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking now about like my granddad and like recognizing things in myself that he like problems that he had and then thinking back to like, I'll be able to talk to him, next year, like, and then he died, at like in his early 70s. So it's like, just, you don't have the time.
Yeah, you don't. And and that's what my grandmother had come up from Guyana to live with us for a little while I was in my late 20s. Like I had gone to the other side of the country. And I remember coming back to New York and my grandma would be there. And I would one year I was just like, and I had started to study herbalism. I just sat with like a pen and a paper and just asked my grandmother some things about our family history. And my mom, even now when I'm like, Mom, but no, this happened. She's like, how do you know that? And I'm like, Granny told me. And she, she would say to me, like, she told you that? I cannot believe and I was like, yeah, because no one really was like really asking those questions. So she wasn't really answering them. But now, now that she had someone with her who was like so interested in these questions, she was like answering those questions. So I think it's also like you said, like Isaac, like recognizing the time that we have and how limited it is. And then like really asking them questions and recording them or writing it down or,
Yeah, that's a way to circumvent your mom's generation that doesn't want to talk.
Exactly.
Yeah, knowing the right questions to ask is also so important.
Yes, absolutely. And opening it, just like, tell me your story on this, and it's not like to be so directing the conversation, but let the conversation just flow. I also feel like you talked about connection to ancestors. I think that's another thing. It's like, going before our ancestors and asking them what they think we should know, and not to be so like, tell me about plants, but rather tell me about the story. Tell me about the story that help me dream about the story. Help me, understand the story that connected you to this plant. What caused you to want to work with this plant? How did it show up for you, instead of having this this preconceived notion of what we want to hear from the ancestors, because oftentimes it's not going to come that way.
Yeah. And well, yeah, I mean, it seems one of the things that makes spiritual herbalism is how interconnected all the things are.
Yeah.
Like you can't separate the story from the plant and the healing, you know, it's all kind of part of the same process.
Absolutely. And that's the remembrance piece, right? That's the piece that we talk to folks about. Like, how are you, for me, it's like, I tell my students, I'm like, we're studying, 100 different materia medica in our apprenticeship program by the time you graduate. But I really want you to find a plant that you will remember forever, like forever, that you can pass on to your children and their children. And this remembrance piece it's about the story. It's about the connection to the plant.
Yeah, I think that's so crucial too, is like diving deep into one, like ally, it's like they talk about like digging holes. You can dig a lot of shallow holes or dig like one deep hole, but if you want to hit water, you gotta dig one hole.
Right. And keep going.
Yeah.
Keep going, right.
But yeah, I mean, I sometimes have that problem, and my astrological chart like kind of points in that way, with Sagittarius and Gemini and so on. But like, I like to dabble in a lot of stuff.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like really like focusing on like one plant, either at a time or over a long period of time, I think is so important. We actually had a conversation with one of your students last year about how she found rose.
Who was this?
Fine.
Yeah, it was Anjanae Wilson.
Yeah, Anjanae Wilson. Yes.
Oh, Anjanae. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, she embodied Rose, like full on. Yeah.
Like I actually had a moment when she was speaking of like connecting with like the spirit of Rose, where I felt like I was on like an entheogen or something.
Yes. I was just like, wow, you just jumped fully. Like every time she'd walk in, I was like, you look more and more like Rose. What is it about you? Like gosh, she fully like embodied it.
Yeah, totally. And then now she has an herb business, Rose Gold Alchemy, and
as well it should be called, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have any stories like that about like one particular plant that you got deeply involved with?
I definitely would say hawthorn. Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I think there are two. Hawthorn, the reason I got so deeply involved with hawthorn also is that I live next to Prospect Park and there are a bunch of hawthorn trees there. And I have a favorite hawthorn tree out in the park. And just to be under a hawthorn tree, it's quite magical. It's just like incredibly magical. And so I think the plants that live within your ecosystem or live near you are how you can fall in love with these plants too, like by visiting them, knowing each aspect of their season, knowing like when it's without leaves, knowing when the leaves come in, knowing when the flowers will come in, knowing when the berries will come in, knowing about the thorns that you have to be careful about, right? And it's so delicious too, the hawthorn medicine. And so, yeah, that's a plant that I think like I embody in many ways, including the thorns. Rose, of course, because it's my namesake. I mean, my goodness, it's like so beautiful to be around a rose plant. I mean, yeah. And then I think of holy basil or tulsi because that's a plant that's like indigenous to the land in Guyana. It grew where I grew up and around me, and I could still smell it, and I could still see it in people's front yards or how they would gather it for their spiritual practices and just everywhere. When I go home, it's one of the plants that I go greet first, as I land there on the soil, that smell, it's just incredible. So
I love holy basil.
Those are all really powerful plants too. I mean, like Tulsi is venerated as a goddess in India. Rose is, I think it's like the Western lotus, like the importance of its spiritual potency. And then hawthorn, like, wow. I mean, I just think back to what I've been, learning like old Scottish and English ballads and so on. There's one about True Thomas who sits under a hawthorn tree and then gets abducted by fairies, you know. but there's like that lore goes way back about how, you know, being in the like hawthorn is a portal tree.
Yes, I feel it. I feel it definitely. Yeah.
So then, you know, we were talking about the heart and the circulatory system, and I often will associate grief with the heart. And I mean, I think that makes sense, but you also bring up the point that the respiratory system and our respiratory health is intrinsically linked with grief. And I'm wondering if you can describe that and talk a little bit about how the respiratory system and grief are linked.
Well, I think well, it's not, I think, I know that our lungs store so much of our unexpressed grief. And our breath is so connected to expression. You know, I talk about in the book, like sometimes when something hits you, the first thing that goes is your breath. Like you get some sad news and you're like, I am completely out of breath. A lot of people who are anxious are completely out of breath, right? All of these things are tied to so much of our emotions, and especially those that we struggle to express, including the voice. Like sometimes we have to breathe before we speak, or like get grounded in our breath before we can say something that's difficult to say. You know, the breath is connected to that. And so you know, throughout the lineage of like people with asthma or people with chronic bronchitis, you know, I talk to them about like, what are you wanting to say? What are you not saying? What's not coming right now? What is, you know, what do you keep holding here in your chest that's making it so heavy and tight, right? And how to gain that expression. And of course, the plants that I love are like mullein to soften, you know, that soften that grief that you might be holding, that long outdated grief, elecampane, right? To like expel, you know, literally bring it up out of the chest, are two of the herbs that I talk about when I talk about healing the lungs.
Yeah, I've definitely, I have seen that, you know, firsthand with people who are in the grief, like on the grief train, experiencing it on the regular. Like they are more susceptible to lung infections, or they're just crying so much and there's so much mucus. And yeah, the elecampane to like help expectorate and like get that out has been such an ally. And it does make sense to me that like now that you like have spelled it out for me in your book, that it's like unexpressed grief gets caught in our lungs. And yeah, those two herbs are amazing allies just to support it. So yeah, thank you for bringing that like to my attention, you know, through the book.
You're welcome.
Yeah, totally. I just want to say one thing about your book too, is that it offers like not only a whole picture of spiritual herbalism and of healing, but it has like some great recipes and amazing illustrations, and the photos of you are so beautiful. It just like, it makes me feel like I'm with you in your apothecary space, you know, like mixing up some medicines. And I just want to just acknowledge that and just tell you how much I appreciate it.
Thank you. I wanted it to feel like really accessible for people who didn't even try herbalism before.
Yeah.
I also wanted it to be like, you know, I tell people I didn't want someone to like have to read through the whole book at once. Like I wanted them to be like, they can, a chapter can encapsulate your experience, and then you can come back to it at another time. So I tried to like put the recipes with the chapter. So kind of like try this and then see how it works through your body, because here we're talking about healing some deeply held things, right? We're talking about healing ancestral trauma, your own trauma. And so you may need some time to process in between and then come back to it before you take on another body system and all the healing that has to happen there, you know.
Yeah,
Totally.
And everyone's got kind of a different problem that they're experiencing, you know. Something might jump out to them about the respiratory system or the heart, or that's one of the things I really like about the book too, is how it was put together. Like you have like the respiratory, like the body system, the like spiritual influences, astrology, the orishas, and then like the actual, like, the technical information and the plants,
Yes, absolutely. A deep dive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really like combining astrology and herbalism, and it seems like you do too. We've been watching some of your stuff on Instagram. You always talk about like the astral weather. But I'm interested to know like how you came to astrology and how you came to put them together. Herbalism.
Yeah. So herbalism, I studied herbalism first. I did in my herbalism practice, I had an astrology lesson in my herbalism practice. And that lesson was all I needed. I was just like, oh my gosh, like this is everything. It explains everything about so much about what I want to know about these plants and how and why my grandfather only did certain work on full moon, or my grandfather did only certain work on like the new and rising moon, or like the waning moon, why it was so important to my grandmother, like all of these things. I was like, oh, like this makes total sense about why. So I had when I came back to New York, I had an astrology teacher. Like I started to study on my own before. And then, well, she up to this day, she wouldn't call herself my teacher, but I call her my mentor, and her name is Elaine. And I had gone to her for a reading, and we just spent, I don't know, maybe 6 hours for my first reading, because we couldn't stop talking about the planets and how this formula then makes sense. And I started to create formulary based on where the planets were and it grew deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the work. And I tell everyone now, I'm like, yeah, well, I study two things that never has an end. I study herbalism and I study astrology, and I will be studying for the rest of my life. So even though I've been studying astrology now for almost 20 something years, I'm still like, I feel like every time I'm at the beginning, because someone will say something like, do you know about this new planet that we've discovered, or this new asteroid? Or I'm just like, oh, I'll never be done. And it's the same with plants. I never feel like I'm ever, because I go home and I tell people I'm a novice when I go home. And, I'm maybe, but folks will be like, Karen Rose, master herbalist here. And then I go home and I'm like, oh my God, what is this? What is this thing, growing here? And they're like, oh, that plant, oh, that's for this, it's like, it will be endless. As when I go to Jamaica, I go anywhere else, I'm always like learning. Back at the stage of like, yeah. And I love that. I love to always learn.
Yeah.
Me too.
Totally. Me
It's
too.
fun. Yeah. They say like when you stop learning is when you die, is basically.
Yeah. So let's keep going.
Right.
Totally.
And yeah, astrology and herbalism really you can just keep going on forever. And like you always learn new things, but then they're like always like translating some ancient text.
I know. And that's how actually my mentor teaches often. She'll teach you just enough, and then she'll like recommend 20 books. And I'm like, I don't have time. Like, I don't have time to do all of this, And when you go back, she's like asking, like, did you? And she's a native of this land. She's an indigenous Blackfoot woman. And she will say to me, like, she also is like, and then did you notice that this was happening? This thing in the news was happening because of this transit. And I'm like, I can, I'm like, if only I could get where you are.
Yeah, there's so many components. You got to pay attention.
Right. And she's made it her life, so she's like, it's really beautiful to watch.
But one of the nice things about both of those is that like there's all the theoretical knowledge and all the book learning, but when it really comes down to it, it's the practical experience, like doing charts, like looking at transits, like looking at all that stuff, and like and actually healing people.
Yeah, and then it becomes, and it's also magical when you can like feel it, like, oh, it like all be, like all the parts of it just becomes like comes together at once, and you feel that inside, like, yes, these planets exist in our bodies, right? So many times I'm like, yeah, I could teach you about the planets, but I can also teach you about the aspects of how it shows up in your body. And I think that's when we really begin to feel it, not just in our heads, but we really begin to feel the planets and the aspects internally. Just like medicine, like we could talk to you about a plant for forever. I can tell you all the aspects of raspberry, but if you took it for 2 weeks, that's your best understanding. Like, I'm like, all right, well, yeah, sitting with raspberry for a while and drinking that medicine, I could tell you what a tannin is, and I could tell you what tannins do. But once you feel a tannin and you feel what it does, I don't have to tell you that much about it anymore.
Totally.
Or like valerian, you can explain, yeah, valerian kind of smells like this or tastes like that. But then when you actually tincture of it or smell a fresh root, you're like, oh, I'm never going to not know what valerian smells like.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why, oftentimes when it comes to constituents of plants, I'm like, the way I could teach this is to show you better than to teach you about it.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And then, but also like recognizing like what flavors and smell, like what is happening to your body and your senses, and attaching that to like the labels, like astringent or
Absolutely.
aromatic.
Absolutely. And that is all. That's it. That's like the way. And that's why, we can have as many, and I feel like that oftentimes we can have as many courses as we want, but it's actually getting people to experience these plants themselves that really brings about the part about the remembrance and this learning that's so deep that's going to continue on. Yeah, because for a long time, I even studying Chinese medicine, I was like, what does pungent mean? Like, you can't really describe pungent to me until I smell pungent, it's just a word. It's like acrid.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great, wonderful. But like, until I feel it, I'm like, oh, that's pungent. Now I know, I smell what pungent means.
Yeah.
Totally. You need the experience to like back up just the new word.
Absolutely.
For understanding.
Kind of like the ineffability of everyday life.
Exactly.
So we're coming up on our hour, and I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit more about your apprenticeship program, and like what is it like to study with you? Like what did you do differently from the apprenticeship program that you're working for when you first started out, and you decided in that moment, like, I need to start my own program? Like, what is it like to be an apprentice?
Well, I think the first thing, so what is it like being an apprentice of mine? I would probably ask an apprentice before me, because I could probably be, well, it's great. And they'll be like, nah, no. So, I think it's both sides of it. I could tell you that it's my favorite thing to do. My favorite thing to do is to teach and to educate new herbalists. And, I'm a storyteller, and I teach from an ancestral perspective, and I bring my ancestors into the room every time. And we concentrate a lot about the spiritual aspects of herbalism. At the same time, I love the science behind herbalism. So, I don't, people will come on to my apprenticeship program thinking that, we're just going to sit and tell stories. And then I'm like giving tests, and I'm like, you need to know what are the actions and properties of all these plants? Was the anatomy and physiology of the body? And folks are like, oh, a little shocked. So they come in, I think I would consider myself a strict teacher. In all the ways that really should matter. Like, if you're going to work on people, these are the things you probably should know. And these are the things that you're not going to get out of this program without, like, you're not going to graduate if you don't know and you don't complete. Like, I'm not willing to be like, oh, you're a sacred herbalist without this work being done. So I think that's probably what an apprentice would probably say. I think anytime you take on a learning this deep and in depth, a spiritual herbalism journey, it will be life-changing. It changes your life, because then you have to, of course it's life-changing. If you're going to have these deep conversations that we just talked about, that you're going to have those conversations with your mother and your father and people around you, your life is going to change. Your relationships are going to shift and change, and you're going to demand more, and things are going to happen, right, in your life. So that's an expectation also. So yeah, the apprenticeship program, I feel it's the level 1 and 2 are about a year long, and level 3 is another year. So it's like I generally say about 2.5 years with me is the apprenticeship program.
You're really in depth.
That's
Mhm,
awesome.
mhm, mhm.
But I think it's important to like, I see these kind of apprenticeship programs or any of these kind of things as initiations, kind of, and like you learn the ropes and how to go forward, but really it's always up to the individual and the student to continue their journey.
It's very true. And I was telling, I have a level 3 who will be graduating next month. And I was telling them that I was like, it feels so, you're like, oh, I'm at the end of my journey, I'm graduating. And I'm like, actually, you're at the beginning.
Right.
Now it's like, oh God, now I have to really go out there and do all this that I've studied. And it feels like you're just starting out on a new journey just when you think that you're like done.
So true. Yeah. So is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners about your work and what you're excited about?
Well, I'm excited about so Sacred Vibes Apothecary turns 13
Wow.
Congratulations.
this year. Yeah, it's an incredible milestone, giving what it takes to run a brick and mortar business in New York City.
Especially the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Yes, it's been such a journey, and I don't want to not celebrate like the way in which that needs to be celebrated, because I have a tendency to be like, yeah, that's great, but keep going, right?
Hopefully,
But
yeah.
yeah, I just want to like pause and be like, wow, like we made it this far as an herbal shop. And I tell people all the time, I'm like, herbalists don't open up community apothecaries to get rich. They open community apothecaries because they want to serve. Because we're not going to get rich selling an ounce of herbs for $3 something. Really, it's not marijuana. We like, it's like peppermint. Like, you're not going to get rich like selling peppermint for $3 and something cents. It's really an opportunity. The reason that we opened Sacred is that because people didn't have access to herbal medicine in their community, and I was like seeing clients and wanting them not to go into the city. So I was like, let me just open in Brooklyn an herbal apothecary. So with that being said, I'm really grateful for the support that our community offers, and not even my apothecary, but it's so important to keep community apothecaries open in your neighborhood, because they really are a central place where people can find so much information. And as we were talking about, Isaac, there's a lot of misinformation on plants. And if, the folks, the herbalists that are opening community apothecary are a resource to their community. And so, this is my pitch to like support community apothecaries and keep them open forever, because those are the places that some of us wandered into, at some point in our life, and was like, oh my gosh, like I'm in love. I fall in love with herbalism. So yeah, supporting us and supporting the apothecary is really amazing, from, like the thing that I want to encourage folks to do.
So you're going to have a party?
Yes, we are. We're actually going to have a party like we had our first year, which was kind of like a sidewalk party. We closed off the sidewalk and had a whole party, and that's what we're planning on doing. So let's pray that May is warm. It's warmer than today. Let's hope that like May 1st, and it's the 1st of May. So it's also like, a really pivotal day. Yeah, I always think about Hawthorne too, because May is like, Hawthorne has all this like May bush, Maythorn, May, all the May festivities all around it. So yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I love that. I'm so excited for you. 13. Yeah, that's a lucky number. Cool.
For sure.
Well, yeah, this has been amazing. We've been wanting to talk with you for a while, and congratulations on the book. It's beautiful, on the Apothecary, and the new you put out, you're opening new places too, the spice shop.
Yeah, we have the Botanica, Sacred Botanica and Sacred Spice, which is a spice shop. And then all of our magical medicines are at the Botanica.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Karen, for being with us today. It was really fun getting to hear your stories and learn from you.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm so glad that you reached out. And yeah, I enjoyed today also.
Awesome. Well, thank you and have a nice rest of the day.
You too. Bye, Isaac. Take care.